Hi everyone, my name's Dr. Matt Nims and I'm one of the technical officers here at the National Marine Science Centre, and I specialise in genetics. But before I started doing that, I did a lot of work with sea slugs, and I still participate in a citizen science program called Sea Slug Census. So my involvement in that is mainly taxonomic, so in other words offering my services as a person to help identify sea slugs. And as a citizen science program, it seeks to look at the distribution of sea slugs around the country wherever these sea slug programs are conducted. Now, I know some of you aren't going to know what a sea slug is, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about that because that's not really the point of this talk. But generally, they're the shellless mollusks in the shallow subtidal and intertidal areas, and for a lot of people they are quite photogenic, and for that reason we can actually encourage people, citizen scientists particularly, to take photographs of them and then send them to us for identification. So what we then get in that data is a picture of the critter and then the location of where it was found and the date. That's fairly straightforward stuff, but it's all captured by the photo itself. So in terms of the complexity of recording that kind of information, it's not very difficult at all. Now, sea slugs have very short lives, so when most critters that have short lives have very, very many young, which means that there's many, many generations in a relatively short period of time. So most of them only live for 3 odd months, and for that reason, you could have potentially 4, maybe even 5 generations in a calendar year for us. And because they can make several populations, several generations in such a short period of time, they can respond very, very quickly to change in the environment. And they are responding quite significantly to climate change in the marine environment, particularly here on the east coast where it's a climate change hotspot. We know it is. We've got data loggers in the water actually telling us that temperature's rising. So we're not looking for them to confirm that that's happening. We know that already. But what happens is the animals' distributions shift, and they have a nice Goldilocks zone, the sort of preferred water temperature, and of course they're intrinsically tied to their food source. So we're getting a shift in their food source, which goes along with these temperature latitudes, if we could think of it like that. And in New South Wales, it's really obvious because it's got such a strong north-south coast line that warming is really, really obvious in the southern part of New South Wales particularly. So what these critters do is they can move into novel locations where they've never been found before, and then persist for a season or even persist permanently and then set up a self-sustaining population there. And so we've got these animals moving south. The southern distribution limit is moving further and further south as temperatures in the marine environment encourage that, and they can persist there. So they're not actually telling us it's warming, but what happens when you get a new introduction in any ecosystem is things change. We haven't had any obvious cataclysmic changes, and they're often the things that we look for when we have a new species introduction. But what you do get is a potential change in the ecology. So the displacement of a species that may already be occupying that sort of niche, or we may have an alteration to the food source of the sea slug itself. And they are many and varied, ranging from algae material through sponges, other sea slugs themselves are a potential candidate for being eaten. So we have potential for environmental change as a result of sea slugs moving into new places. So the question then arises, what do we do with that information that we get from this citizen science program? And we can generate a list for each of the locations where we run a citizen science, the actual sea slug census. And in New South Wales we run them, well, Gold Coast, so we can consider the Tweed as part of that northern part of New South Wales, even though it is truly Queensland. We run one at Coffs Harbour here, and one at Port Stephens, and then also on the south coast around Merimbula, Bermagui down there. And there's also a Sydney sea slug census smack bang in the middle of the coast there. So we've got data from those on multiple occasions over multiple years, and always we turn up a new critter. And Steve Smith and I, so Professor Steve Smith and I, documented a whole bunch of new range distribution limits for sea slugs, particularly, and we're mainly interested in southern limits. Many of them have a limit at the north which extends right up to the equator, so it's not such a concern. And you're welcome to read this paper, but really what it does is it summarizes a whole bunch of other papers that we wrote, which are singular distribution change papers. So you can see here in this graphic, so this figure, there's a whole bunch of sea slugs that have extended their range variously south, most of them ending up around Port Stephens because that's a really significant place where we do censuses. It doesn't mean they're not found further south than that, it's just that's where we happen to find them. And then also a few over here to the right, which are in south coast range shifts. We've only really dealt with animals that have shifted probably about more than 500 kilometres further south than where they were previously documented. But it's simple case of where was it before, we've found one now in this location and documenting that, and we've done that for a good number of 37 odd species here. We can do that because we know what the species is, so it's important to understand your invertebrate ID, and we have a good, decent record of where it was previously located. Some of it hasn't even been found in New South Wales before. You can see some of those longer bars there represent animals that may have come from the northern Great Barrier Reef or even elsewhere, so up near Samoa, New Caledonia, etc., and then they've been found in New South Wales for the first time. Now you could potentially argue, well, they've always been here, no one's ever noticed, and that's always going to be a caveat to add to that kind of declaration of range extension, but on the whole, it's been facilitated by global climate change and warming. Feel free to have a look at the Sea Slug Census Facebook page. It's a public page, and you can also look at this without being actually on Facebook, so to speak, just by searching up Sea Slug Census Facebook. And it gives you, there's a few posts that people place on there just regarding their individual sightings, and then we'll give them some tips on the identification. But it's also an opportunity to have a look at upcoming sea slug censuses, reports for censuses that have just occurred, and you can access those reports. The reports are in PDF format, and they list every individual sighting with a photograph and an explanation potentially as to why it was identified as one species and not another, where you have confusing species. But it's a program you're welcome to get involved in, and we have censuses happening all around Australia now, even over on the west coast, so they're fairly recent, and so it's certainly taking off. But yeah, have a good look at that. Thanks for your attention.